In the spring of 2003, Dr. Evelyn Moore was nearing the end of another long day at the New Hampshire Museum of Military Heritage when she came across a box that wasn't listed in any of the records. It was tucked behind a row of crates in the basement archive, covered in dust, wrapped in linen and sealed with a faded emblem she didn't recognize, ornate, almost regal, and unlike anything typically associated with American military artifacts. Evelyn, meticulous by nature, had no intention of staying late that night, but something about the box unsettled her. There was no tag, no number, no donor file, just a heavy sense that it wasn't meant to be found. Inside, she found a large photograph, carefully rolled and protected by what remained of crumbling tissue paper. Even before she laid it flat on the table, she sensed it was different. The paper was thick and pristine, untouched by the decades. As she unrolled it under the glow of the archive lamp, the image slowly revealed itself. A massive formation of soldiers, row after row, shoulder to shoulder, dressed in formal uniforms with high collars, polished buttons, and stoic expressions. The composition was perfect, each man precisely placed, hats aligned, posture identical, eyes forward. In the lower right-hand corner, handwritten in black ink, May 5th, 1903. At first, she admired the symmetry, the discipline, but then, leaning closer, she noticed something deeply unusual. The photo was impossibly sharp, not just clear. For 1903 standards, it was unfathomable. She could make out individual threads on a sergeant's cuff, the slightly cracked leather of a boot, a cigarette butt flattened beneath a heel. One man in the back row had a scar just above his eyebrow. Another, near the front, was squinting ever so slightly, as if the sun had shifted in that exact moment. There was no blur, no grain, no deterioration. It was as if the photo had been taken yesterday, with modern, even advanced, optical equipment. Perplexed, Evelyn took digital snapshots of sections of the photograph and emailed them to Jason Adler, a historian at Dartmouth and longtime friend with deep knowledge of early American military technology. He called her back almost immediately. His voice, usually measured, was tinged with disbelief. "That's not possible," he said. "That level of detail. It doesn't exist for that period." He drove to the museum that night. Together, in the quiet of the basement archive, they examined the image through magnification. With each pass, new details emerged. An errant button undone, the slight smirk on a young soldier's lips, fingerprints in the dust of a rifle barrel. It wasn't just technically impressive, it was unnatural. No lens, no plate, no film available in 1903 could have produced what they were looking at. And yet there it was, silent, immaculate, and real. Jason scanned portions of the image into his laptop, using high-resolution capture. At nearly 3 in the morning, after hours of analysis, he sat back and whispered what Evelyn had been thinking, but didn't dare say aloud. "This wasn't made with anything we've ever studied, not from that era, maybe not from this one either." The conversation turned then from technology to intent. Who had taken the photo? Why was it hidden? And what kind of camera could have achieved such impossible clarity? They submitted a formal inquiry to the National Archives the following day, including digital scans and a detailed report. Normally, responses to such requests took weeks, if they came at all, but this time the answer arrived in under 48 hours. It didn't come from any known department, but from a group neither of them had ever heard of before, the Department of Advanced Historical Imaging. The email was brief. It thanked them for the submission and requested an in-person meeting. No explanation, no context, just a time, a date, and a location in Washington, D.C. As she stared at the message, Evelyn felt the first chill of something she couldn't quite define. Not fear, not yet, but a sense that whatever they had uncovered had been meant to stay buried, and that the photo, beautiful and precise and impossibly real, was never meant to be seen again. The room was stark, windowless and cold, somewhere deep beneath a federal complex in Washington, D.C. The walls were lined with steel panels and acoustic foam, the kind used in soundproof testing chambers. Evelyn and Jason had passed through 3 security checkpoints and surrendered their phones before being escorted by a silent woman in a grey suit. No introductions had been made, no explanations, just a long corridor, a locked door, and then this room. A man entered precisely at 8, Mid-50s, clean-shaven, dark suit, no visible ID. He didn't introduce himself either. Instead, he placed a manila folder on the table and pushed it toward them. "We call it Project Midas," he said, his voice calm and practiced. It was never supposed to surface. Inside the folder were high-resolution scans of the same photograph Evelyn had found. But these were annotated, each soldier labeled with alphanumeric codes, each section mapped and cross-referenced with what looked like field notes. Some lines were redacted entirely. The man remained still as Evelyn flipped through the pages, her breath catching slightly as she realized this photo had been studied before, thoroughly. Jason leaned in. "What kind of camera took this?" The man hesitated. "We believe it was an early prototype of a high-definition optical recognition system, developed under classified military research between 1898 and 1904. Only a handful of test shots were ever made. The technology was never released, never acknowledged, and officially it does not exist." He explained that the system had been intended for reconnaissance, mass troop identification, movement tracking, even emotion recognition at scale. The hardware had been enormous, unstable, and dangerous to operate. According to what remained of the project records, the camera had required nearly 30 operators and a mobile generator to function. Most of the data from the program had been destroyed in a fire at a naval research facility in 1911. The surviving photograph, the one Evelyn had uncovered, was presumed lost in transit during decommissioning. Evelyn felt a mix of awe and discomfort. But why use it for a portrait? This wasn't a battlefield, it was ceremonial. The man nodded. That's precisely why it was chosen. A static formation, controlled environment. The goal was to see how far they could push the optics in real-world military settings. It was less about the picture itself, more about who was in it. Jason narrowed his eyes. "You mean the soldiers?" A pause. Then the man replied, "Not all of them were soldiers." The room fell silent. The man continued carefully. "Some of the individuals captured in that image had no record of enlistment, no family trace, no known assignments, and yet they appear, identified only by fragments, initials, behavioral notations, flagged anomalies. We believe the photo was also a test in population control, early behavioral tracking, precursor elements of what would later become psychological profiling units within intelligence agencies. It was too much, too fast." Evelyn felt her hands grow cold. "And what do you want from us?" He finally looked her in the eye. "We want nothing. You already found it. That means others might too. And if they do, we need to control the narrative." He slid another folder across the table. It contained a signed agreement, silence, cooperation. If accepted, Evelyn and Jason would be given access to what remained of Project Midas's archives, restricted but expansive. If refused, they would be legally prohibited from discussing the photo publicly. They asked for time. Outside, in the cold DC evening, Evelyn sat on a bench and stared into the traffic, her thoughts tangled. The photograph was no longer just a historical curiosity. It was evidence of something deeper, something designed to observe rather than preserve. She remembered the faces in the image, frozen, crisp, human, and now possibly something else. Jason broke the silence. "If we sign, we get answers, real ones." Evelyn nodded slowly. "But we lose control of the truth." Later that week, back in New Hampshire, Evelyn returned to the photograph. This time, not as a curator, but as a witness. She scanned the image section by section, tracing lines, remapping what she now knew. In the lower left corner, she found something she hadn't noticed before. A figure half-turned, face blurred ever so slightly. Unlike the others, he wasn't looking forward. He was looking to the side, toward the lens, toward whoever was behind the camera. And for the first time, she felt as if the image was looking back. It was 2 in the morning when Evelyn paused the screen. She had been reviewing the digitized version of the photograph at maximum resolution, alone in the museum's archive office, eyes bloodshot, fingers trembling slightly from caffeine and fatigue. She had seen the image 100 times by now, yet this time something made her stop. In the lower left corner, just past the 4th row, behind a captain with a crooked badge, a man stood slightly apart. His posture was uneven, one shoulder lower than the other, and his face, while technically within the focal range, was off. Not blurred, not distorted, just wrong. The lines of his face didn't match the others. The shadows didn't fall the same way. And while every other soldier stared forward with that formal detachment expected in military portraits, this man's gaze was different, tilted, direct. He wasn't part of the group. He was watching it, or perhaps watching whoever was watching the photo. Evelyn isolated his face and enhanced it, then ran it through a facial recognition software connected to several public genealogy and military databases. She expected nothing, just another dead end in a trail full of half names and incomplete records. But what came back wasn't a blank file. It was a match. A man named Thomas R. Elwood, supposedly born in 1878 in Missouri, enlisted briefly in the U.S. Army in 1899 and discharged for injury within the same year. No war records, no known deployments. He was listed as deceased in 1901, 2 years before the photo was taken. She double-checked the dates, the documents, the match. It was 100% certainty. Elwood had died before the photograph existed. Jason arrived at the museum just after dawn, bleary-eyed but alert the moment Evelyn showed him the printouts. They pulled what little they could from Elwood's sparse archive: a small-town birth certificate, a brief obituary in a local Missouri paper, a death certificate signed by a military doctor. No marriage, no children, no burial site on record. He'd simply vanished after his death was recorded, but he was there, in the photo, standing quietly among soldiers he never served with, in a program that was never acknowledged, captured by a technology that shouldn't have existed. Jason suggested a field trip. They drove to the town of Western Missouri, where Elwood had been born and allegedly died. The town hadn't changed much in a century. The local records office, dusty and underfunded, yielded a single photograph of Thomas Elwood, a headshot, likely from his enlistment papers, side by side with the image from the 1903 photograph. The resemblance was undeniable. They visited what remained of his childhood home, now a collapsed structure overtaken by vines and silence. Neighbors had no knowledge of the family. Even the town historian admitted he'd never heard the name. Then, inside the attic of the old records building, Evelyn found something unexpected. A leather-bound ledger marked Census Anomalies, 1900-1910. One page stood out. It listed names of individuals reported alive after being declared dead by official military records. Most had been dismissed as clerical errors or family confusion. But one entry read, T.R. Elwood, cited in Washington, D.C., 1905. Status, unconfirmed. Note, no response from Department of Military Intelligence. Jason read it aloud and fell silent. The implications were growing heavier. It wasn't just a photo. It wasn't just one man. It was a network of ghosts, people written out of history, then brought back for reasons unknown. Back at the museum, Evelyn sat alone once again, the digitized photo open on her monitor. She zoomed in on Elwood's face, froze it, and stared. The detail was inescapable. The slight furrow between his brows, the faint scar above the left temple, and the expression, measured, calm, knowing. What unnerved her most was not the impossibility of his presence, but the feeling that Elwood somehow expected to be found, that he had been waiting. And then she noticed something even more unsettling. Elwood wasn't alone in his gaze. Scattered across the image in far corners and middle rows were at least 4 other figures whose eyes were tilted, not straight ahead like the rest, but toward the lens, toward the operator, or perhaps toward the future itself. They weren't posing, they were watching. Over the following weeks, Evelyn and Jason immersed themselves in the photograph like it was a living document. They no longer saw it as a static image, but as a scene, frozen in time, yet strangely alive. They built a digital grid overlay, assigning each visible figure a code based on position, facial direction, and uniform detail. The process was methodical, exhausting, but it began to reveal something they hadn't expected: a structure. The men who were looking toward the camera, those whose gazes deviated from the military pose, weren't randomly scattered. They formed a subtle pattern, geometric in nature. 4 men arranged in a near-perfect rhombus, one slightly offset near the center, like a keystone anchoring the shape. Elwood was that keystone. Each of the 4 had similar anomalies. Unlisted in military rosters, no death or burial records, inconsistent census entries. Evelyn dubbed them the anchors. The positioning was too precise to be coincidence. Jason, a skeptic by training, struggled to argue. Late one night, they took the overlay to a data scientist at Dartmouth, a trusted colleague named Dr. Lena Shaw. She was known for pattern recognition in historical images, especially battlefield cartography. After a few hours of processing, she leaned back and said something neither of them expected. "This looks less like a formation and more like calibration." Evelyn frowned. "Calibration for what?" Lena hesitated. "For a targeting system. If this photo was taken with a prototype reconnaissance camera, it may have been part of a tracking array. These figures could have been used as fixed data points, live targets inside a passive test. Whoever took this photo wasn't just capturing them, they were marking them. The idea was chilling. The image had been staged not just as a group portrait, but as a test environment. The clarity, the structure, the unnatural precision, it all began to make sense under that lens. They dove deeper into the history of military photographic programs from the late 19th century, especially in connection with covert operations. Most of the official archives had no record of anything like Project Midas, but a retired intelligence archivist, found through a back-channel contact, agreed to speak off the record. His name was Franklin Weller, and he'd worked in military imaging during the Cold War. They met in a small diner just outside Arlington. Weller was old, deliberate, and spoke in fragments, but his words were clear enough to shake them. Back in the 60s, we were still finding traces. Photos, fragments, processing logs. There was a theory inside the agency, a rogue hypothesis really, that some units had experimented with predictive visual analysis, that you could identify a person's intent or risk factor just by how they looked in a moment of high compression, facial data, stress micro-expressions, even time displacement in muscle contraction. Jason raised an eyebrow. That sounds more like science fiction. Weller didn't flinch. It does. But you're looking at the one photo we never explained. He told them that in 1982, a black and white negative had surfaced at a classified debriefing in Langley. It was a reproduction of the same 1903 image. Analysts couldn't determine the camera type, the developer method, or the origin. The photo had circulated among internal divisions, triggering decades of internal theories. Then, it disappeared again. Some of us believed the faces weren't just being documented, Weller said. They were being indexed. Back in New Hampshire, Evelyn reviewed each of the anchor figures again. She enlarged their faces one by one, letting her eyes rest on their expressions. There was no visible fear, no confusion, just focus, as if they were aware, as if they knew their role in something larger. But the breakthrough came not from military records or databases or field visits. It came from a message. A woman named Claire Donnelly had sent an email through the museum's contact form. She had visited the museum a week earlier and seen a printed replica of the photograph on display. She claimed to recognize one of the faces in the back row, not from history books, from a box of photos her grandmother kept in the attic, a family album passed down quietly, never discussed. The man's name was Malcolm Donnelly, and he had never served in the military. According to Claire, he had worked in railway logistics in Ohio his entire life, but in one photo from her family's collection, taken in the 1940s, Malcolm is much older, but unmistakably the same man, the same angular jaw, the same crooked brow, and the same expression, calm, focused, watching. Jason and Evelyn drove to Claire's home just outside Albany. The family photo was aged and grainy, but clear enough for comparison. They overlaid it on the 1903 image, a perfect match. Malcolm Donnelly had aged. He had lived decades after appearing in a photograph supposedly taken before his military service, or before any known record of him began. That night, Evelyn added his face to the pattern, the fifth anchor. The shape was complete now, not a rhombus, but a pentagon. And in the very center of that shape, standing between all 5 points, barely visible behind 2 tall officers, was a sixth figure, only partially in frame. His face was obscured by a motion blur. Unlike the others, he didn't seem part of the formation at all. Evelyn froze the image. Something about that figure felt different, not just misplaced, but wrong, like a glitch, like someone who hadn't meant to be caught. Evelyn knew she had seen that motion blur before. She scoured the digital archive frame by frame, running contrast adjustments and slow layer separations. In every copy of the 1903 photograph, regardless of format or scan source, the same central figure appeared, partially obscured, face undefined, as if caught mid-step during an exposure that should have frozen everything else perfectly. A man in motion in a still world. Impossible. She called Jason at midnight. "There's a sixth presence," she said, voice tight, dead center, blurred, not out of focus, blurred in time. Jason arrived an hour later. Together, they isolated the figure again. He seemed to wear no uniform, no visible insignia, and stood between known points of the pentagon-shaped anchor formation. Evelyn overlaid every version of the photograph, from original scans to museum enlargements. The blur was always present, always the same size, always in motion. Jason finally spoke what they'd both been thinking. He wasn't in the photo, he was passing through it. They went back to Weller, the retired intelligence archivist, bringing him a printed overlay. He didn't even blink before saying, "That's not an anomaly, that's an operator." He explained that during the early days of optical experimentation, there were rumors, whispers mostly, about field engineers who volunteered for direct exposure trials. These were unofficial tests, unmonitored, undocumented. The goal was to test the threshold of visibility under extended aperture mechanics. In simple terms, they tried to capture someone outside the camera's frame of time. Most of those men were never seen again. Some photos, according to Weller, had once shown unexplained shadows, half-forms, ghost limbs, energy distortions, but none, he admitted, had shown anything this direct. "If this is what it looks like," he said slowly, "you're not dealing with a photo. You're dealing with a witnessing mechanism. This was never about capturing an image. It was about proving that a system could see more than the eye." The final link came not through theory but blood. Claire Donnelly contacted Evelyn again. She had gone through more of her grandmother's belongings and found something unusual. An envelope, sealed, marked with a military stamp, dated December 9th, 1954. Inside was a short letter, handwritten, no greeting, no name, just one line. "We are still visible to the machine." The envelope included a photograph, modern, colorized. It showed an elderly man sitting on a park bench. Evelyn recognized him instantly. It was Malcolm Donnelly, still alive, still wearing the same half-smile. But sitting beside him was a younger man in a dark overcoat, mid-turn, face caught in motion blur, the same figure from the 1903 image. Evelyn's hands trembled. This wasn't a photo of the past. It was a photo from within the same sequence, a continuum of exposure running across decades, maybe longer. Somehow, whatever system had captured that original image was still active, still registering those who had once been seen. She and Jason returned to the museum that night with a scanner calibrated for hyperspectral light. They placed the 1903 photograph under it. The screen went black for a moment, then something unexpected appeared, a second layer of embedded light data. The blurred figure had moved. In this spectral red, he was no longer standing. He was gone. Jason pulled back. "It's active," he whispered. "This thing is still watching." They shut everything down, disconnected the scanner, locked the archive, but they both knew it was too late, not because of what they had found, but because of who might now be watching them. The next morning, Evelyn received a package at her home. No sender, no postage, just a box, black, unmarked. Inside was a single object, a lens, smooth, cold, larger than anything she'd seen on standard equipment. Wrapped around the lens was a note: "Once you see, you can't unsee." Jason disappeared 3 days later. No record of travel, no calls, no credit card activity. His office at Dartmouth was emptied without notice. When Evelyn called the university, they claimed he had resigned, but she knew better. She kept the lens hidden. She never opened the photograph again. But every so often, when the house was still and the light outside changed too quickly, she'd feel a sensation, fleeting, untraceable, like something was scanning, not her surroundings, her. A year later, the museum quietly retired the exhibit. The photograph was placed back in storage, its location misfiled, its presence forgotten. But Evelyn knew it would surface again, because the image was never meant to capture a moment in time. It was meant to connect them, and the machine, it was still running.